8 LCS titles on 3 different teams, brought 2 orgs from relegations, 1 LCS MVP trophy, 4 times back-to-back titles within the LCS, MSI finalist, and last retired pro from season 1. This guy has so many different fucking accolades that it's insane just to think of the scope and the history that is Doublelift. I mean, he's someone that has essentially transcended the game itself and become kind of a small pop icon, as it were, especially if you think within the broader terms of esports itself and the scope that it has of just, Counter-Strike people know about him, Dota people know about him, fucking Rocket League, like what have you. There are multiple different esports titles in the sphere that knows about him and outside the sphere as well too. And so I think what's crazy, and I think the embodiment of what Doublelift was within his entire career, was that he was all hands and no brain, right? Like that was like the famous saying. And I still laugh at that kind of characterization of him, because there's still a ring of truth to that, even to this current day, although he's kind of tried to shore up those weaknesses. But that's always been his moniker, and that's not to really knock him. I think in some essence that should be a badge of honor to say that because of his all hands, he was kind of uncontested in that sense, that his mechanics were essentially unrivaled within all of North America, and there was no one that had better hands than him in any fucking role, in fact, I would argue. And so this came about, of course, because Chowster famously said that he was an ADC player, young kid, that he would just guide and macro around the map and tell him what to do at every certain moment, even micro around the map, and just tell him what to do and to click on heads, right? He was kind of like a fucking an FPS player in that sense, maybe the embodiment of that within League of Legends. And I think what's crazy about Doublelift, and by the way, for those that are curious, I'll do a proper send-off of Doublelift through a written piece, right? Because I just don't think the scope of his career can actually be covered within the voice aspect or the orator aspect, unless you're good enough. I don't know. But I kind of like how he has transcended all of his weaknesses. In terms of how he was one of the only ADCs in LCS history to ever be considered a Shockcaller. And that's one of the things that I think is really ridiculous about his career, is that traditionally ADCs, even still today, are not considered someone who is able to macro everyone around the map and make sure that everyone is in the right position, or maybe do late game calling or mid game shot calling or whatever. And I know that term is somewhat tainted in the sense that people often say, well, yeah, one person doesn't hive mind control all the rest of the entire team. But I think that was an always disingenuous aspect of how to view shot calling, as it were anyways. I don't think it ever actually meant that. And in fact, it meant that you had most of the power, most of the decision making as for the final call of what things are going to happen and whatnot. And sure, there was some give and take to where you would be able to micromanage people to a larger or a lesser degree, but I always felt like that was the essence of the term, as it were anyways. So I think for people that are saying that a shot caller means that they control every single aspect of their entire team, micro and macro and early game and mid game and late game, is just, I think it's very disingenuous and very false and faulty logic in that sense. But I do believe that Doublelift in a sense, tried to shore up his weaknesses in that he didn't have an early voice in his early CLG days, right? He was just, like I said, the right click bot. And so him to then go up and say, hey, like, I'm really mechanically gifted, but there is this weakness in my gameplay. I want to try and shore that up, and I want to become this voice, and I want to lead the team, and I want to demand the resources, and I want to make sure that we know the end game plan and whatnot. Like, I think that is very admirable of Doublelift himself. And then you have to consider the greatness of his career in that he was one of the first personalities within League of Legends to ever expose themselves to the entire fan base, the entire audience, right? This is at an era to where, you know, you're still a nerd, you're still, you know, playing video games for a living or not for a living, in fact, and you're just playing video games for the hell of it and trying to take it seriously. But it's this shift to where you now open yourself up to the entire world because, as you know, many might not remember, this is when the internet was more blooming into the mainstream, right? Like everyone back in the day was still on the internet. All the nerds were on the internet anyways. That's when all the nerds were picking up the internet, as it were. But now you get broadened out into the wider mainstream idea, right? And so now you have even more eyeballs on you. And so if you can imagine, this is what the early League of Legends pros were going into, because this was one of the earliest, biggest esports of all time, right? Like, yeah, of course there was StarCraft and whatnot, but that was largely in Korea, right? The League of Legends was one of the earliest global esports in the entire world, at least to grow to the magnitude that it was at, right? Like, yeah, you could say Counter-Strike 1.6 or I guess not Counter-Strike Source, but Counter-Strike 1.6 was both in Europe and in the US to a somewhat large degree, but it never penetrated the East. Then you had, you know, over in the East, it was StarCraft and whatnot, but it never really penetrated over into the West, like in North America. This was like one of the first true global esports. And to be essentially the face of that for the Western audience, right? And also to then expose your face over to the people from the East and say, oh, who are the best players over in the West? It's fucking Doublelift, right? Like, he was front and center and all that shit, along with Hotshot GG, Reginald, the Odd One, Dyrus, like all those guys. They all had the eyes of the populace upon them. And to kind of realize that and almost see that through the scrutiny of being on stream all the time or just through content creation or whatnot, this was just something that I don't think a lot of people appreciate about Doublelift's career, and the fact that he kind of grew up as he was on live, I don't know, like quote unquote television, right? He was like the fucking Truman Show. That's probably a dated reference to like 90% of you, but he was literally the Truman of esports. And I mean, I'm not going to go into that. There were some dubious things back in the day that pro players had either said or did. So we won't get into that, but Doublelift was a part of that era. And it's insane to see that he can kind of grow up and transition, and you can actually see the progression of him kind of as a character. Like, we always consider someone a character as someone fictitious or whatnot, but Doublelift is like this real life character in that essence. It's like this story that unfolds and writes itself. It's just like reality kind of developing itself through a book, and like that's how I view Doublelift's career in a sense. And then you go all the way back to his origin story of him getting kicked out of his house, you know, from his mother, being homeless and whatnot. And so there's a Reddit thread that I'll link in the description box below, but it's It's a Reddit thread of him saying that he is now homeless and is now kicked out of his house. And in that Reddit thread, there is Travis's famous reply to where he's like, "Hey, Doublelift, I DM'd you. Just kind of reply back to me." And that was like the whole relationship that was developed from that. So I suggest a lot of people, if you want to go down a time warp, in essence, like, yeah, that's a really good thread, because you see a lot of old school names kind of replying and whatnot. But Doublelift came from that era to where you weren't making any money anyways. You know, he had some money that he had won from tournaments or whatnot that really was dubious if it was ever going to come through or not throughout his PayPal or whatever. And it just goes to show you like the humbleness and the hardships that Doublelift has had to come through in order to succeed. And I don't want to say that it's just because, you know, he was homeless or whatnot, but there's also the psychological aspect of somewhat being disowned from your own family and whatnot, and not having that emotional support from other people that you care about. I think it's a very big and underrated aspect within esports that a lot of people don't talk about, because it's an uncomfortable subject in that essence. And some people that try and go further and further into esports are rejected by the people that they care about, because they're going down this path that seems so unlikely to succeed in. And in some right, people are just trying to dissuade them from going that route because it's so difficult to do, and I can understand that aspect. But Doublelift is like one of those people that persevered and just fought through sheer will, and that demands a level of respectability, I guess. And then on top of that, Doublelift was one of the few players very early on that brought us the art of trash talk, right? This is something that he's always been famous for throughout his career, but it's kind of this essence into which, if you're just a traditional esports viewer, you have no concept of this, because it's not really done within esports traditionally, like it's done, through solo queue and whatnot, or whatever, but it's not done in a meaningful way through professional play until Doublelift comes onto the scene and kind of popularizes it and makes it kind of his norm and his regular thing. And now, back into the early time, this kind of worked against his favor, right? Because he was never the guy that could back up the results or whatnot. And he was always like the second best guy or whatever, right? And he would always trash talk the people above him or below him. He didn't really give a fuck. But that's what made him so likable in that sense, right? He was like this villain of the LCS. He was always the villain of the LCS. And that's what made his relationship within esports just so fucking cool, right? No matter if you hated him or if you loved him, it was the fact that he created a storyline that you could follow throughout the entire history of the LCS. And like it was always this dividing factor of whether you love or you hate Doublelift. And that's why I think his storyline was so attractive in that sense, is that people could choose a side, and it would be like this dividing factor, and it would be fun in a way. And I hope that he felt that in the end it was kind of fun, right? Especially early in his CLG days, where people really didn't like him because of the things that he would say and the brashness that he would bring. So you look out just throughout his career, it's insane how many metas this guy has gone through. I mean, he went through the ADC bot lane meta. ADCs used to not be in the bot lane at all, in fact, when you go before Season 1 World Championship. And then, of course, Europe popularized the idea of having the ADC go bot with the support. And then you have the Juggernaut meta, if you want to go forward in time, or the Mage bot lane meta, or lane swap, or funnel, or assassin meta, or, you know, the ADC meta of Season 3, Sightstone meta. Like, this guy has been through so many different meta. It's just insane the level of longevity that he's gone through, and that he's pretty much remained at the top in essence, right? He's always been considered like a top 3 ADC throughout NALCS. And it's no wonder. It's because he just has the ability and the mind to adapt himself, right? And to kind of grind in essence. And maybe that's the reason why he has retired, so to speak. So all in all, just from my initial impressions of Doublelift retiring, it hasn't even been 24 hours, but Doublelift is the greatest North American player to ever play the game, without a doubt in my mind. I think that, if anything, rookies should be looking up to him for his kind of perseverance, his willingness to never give up, right? His continuing idea towards perfection, to laugh in the face of his fucking haters, to continue even though people thought he wasn't a winner, thought he was a failure that couldn't be compatible with his teammates or whatnot, and always tried to drive this inner argument within his teams. And like, a lot of people thought that he was a failure in this essence, but I think that's what I envision his legacy as. It's not a failure, is that he's this outcast. He's the downtrodden. He's the person who realized their weaknesses and tried to shore them up as best as he could. Doublelift, to me, represents an unwillingness to let mediocrity get in the way of his ambitions. For that, I think he should always be remembered for. And in that way, I think he not only transcended his region, but even his own esport that he helped build and create.